Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
In his diary, Flight Out of Time, one of the key documents of the initial phase of Dada activity in Zurich, Hugo Ball looked back to the activities of a year previous and noted, strange events. While we had our cabaret in Zurich, Mr. Ulyanov Lenin, if I am not mistaken, lived across the street. He must have heard every evening of our music and tirades. I wonder whether with pleasure or profit. And while we opened our gallery in the Bahnhofstrasse, the Russians travelled to St. Petersburg to start the revolution. Is Dadaism, in the end, our sign and gesture, the counterpart to Bolshevism? Does Dadaism confront destruction and absolute calculation with the completely quixotic, purposeless, and incomprehensible world? This quotation is useful in several ways. First of all, it draws a direct parallel between the activities of Dada as an experimental avant-garde art movement and revolutionary politics, suggesting that the coexistence of Lenin and the Dadaists on the same street in Zurich was something more than mere coincidence. Secondly, it proposes for us a way of understanding the aesthetic activity of the Dadaists who'd come together in Zurich, and that in some way they sought to counterpose the turmoil of the First World War and possibly the Revolution of 1917, since Ball's diary entry was written concurrently with the rise of the Bolsheviks, with a particular view of reality as inherently incoherent and irrational. This view of Dada has held sway in much of the literature, but what is less often done is to think through the extent to which Dada irrationalism was in itself political, however much it might be understood as paralleling rather than participating in the dramatic events of the period. It's certainly been noted by various commentators that adherence to Dada, as the movement spread to other venues after its initial period in Zurich in 1916-17, held strong political convictions. The Berlin group, which was formed after Richard Hülsenbeck left Zurich for Berlin in 1917, is widely seen as the most politically motivated of all the Dada factions. Richard Shepard neatly draws a distinction between the two main tendencies of the artists and writers grouped in the city. On one side, we would find Wieland Herzfeld, John Hartfield and George Gross, who were members of the German Communist Party, KPD. On the other hand stood Richard Hülsenbeck, Raoul Hausmann, Hannah Höch, and Johannes Baader, whose sympathies lay more in the direction of anarchy. The revolutionary aspirations of the entire group were perhaps best summarized in the manifesto, What is Dadaism and What Does It Want to Achieve in Germany of 1919, authored by Hausmann and Hülsenbeck, where the authors demanded the international revolutionary unification of all creative and spiritual persons on the basis of radical communism, the progressive abolition of labor through mechanization, and the abolition of private property. When it came to producing art, or anti-art, Richard Shepard very usefully distinguishes between two modes of working which are aligned with the two political strands informing this overall ethos. In line with a series of essays by Wieland Herzfeld of 1921, the communist faction of the group tended, in Herzfeld's terms, towards an unmasking of bourgeois society as a destroyer of happiness and justice, and sought to attack the incompleteness of the world as it exists. The tendency of these artists was thus towards social satire. By contrast, the anarchist faction maintained that, quote, revolutionary art is not revolutionary by virtue of its ideological purity or politically motivated satirical edge, but by virtue of its otherness, its commitment to flux, absurdity, experimentation, and psychic freedom. Now, the communist sympathies of the Berlin Dadaists and their positive response to the Russian Revolution and the art that followed it in its immediate wake are most succinctly emblematized in a photograph of John Hartfield and George Gross holding a placard at the first International Dada Fair, held in June 1920, which declares, art is dead, long live the machine art of Tatlin. As it happens, they could hardly have known of Tatlin's work very well at this time. But this gesture clearly declares their pro-Russian sympathies and their desire for an aesthetic revolution in which the artist would be akin to a construction worker or engineer, rather than an isolated genius figure intent on exploring his or her unique sensibility. For the Berlin Dadaists, the technique of photomontage would become the ideal means of conveying this new artistic credo. The photomonteur was someone who fitted together scraps of pre-existing printed and photographic imagery on the analogy of a factory worker fitting together parts of a machine. And of course, machine imagery is there in this work as well. Between November 1918 and August 1919, the leftist political sympathies of the entire Berlin Dada group, whether they were communists or anarchists, were ignited by the Spartacist uprising and its suppression. The group collaborated on the magazine Everyone His Own Football, a parody of a right-wing newspaper, which was sold by the Dadaists in the working class districts of Berlin, selling approximately 75,000 copies. The communist-inclined members of the group, including Grosch and Hartfield, produced the most overt commentaries on the savage reprisals meted out by Friedrich Ebert's government against revolutionary soldiers and workers' councils. Grosch's cover for Die Pleite, number 3 of 1919, pictures a military leader responsible for sending the Freikorps into action, drinking a toast to Gustav Noske, the Minister of the Interior who had ordered the action. He's drinking a toast. The toast is to the disarming of the workers, although, of course, they'd been massacred. Here we have a clear example of the satirical impulse of the communist-affiliated Dadaists. Around at the same time, the less overtly politicized anarchist wing produced collages, montages, deploying a radical language of a visual collision and disintegration, in which the entire value systems seem to be relativized and brought into collision. This is actually from the Cologne Dadaist Max Ernst. It's a slightly different style, same period, of course. Whilst Dadaists such as Gross immediately responded to the revolutionary uprising in Berlin, it is more correct in the final analysis to say that Berlin Dada was constituted in the aftermath of the event. The previous utopianism of German expressionist artists and writers in particular was replaced by a tough acceptance that life is constituted out of struggle and flux. In his presentist manifesto, read in Prague during a 1921 Dada tour, Haussmann rejected the idea of any appeal to a distant future in favor of, quote, the unhistorical human being who attains consciousness entirely in the present. Dada despair at the failure of the German Revolution translated into a vision of strife as something possessing its own inner dynamic. In the context of Zürich Dada, the novelist Otto Flacker has his hero, in the novel Nein und Ja, ask, what if in these matters, socialism, the republic, democracy, capitalism, i.e. practical questions, are not the core, but projections, symbols, manifestations? What if it is a question of something quite different, a question of the struggle between dynamic and non-material energies? One has to account therefore for a strangely euphoric mood in Dada, which transcends political or social contingencies. Commentators such as Shepard have pointed in particular to the Dada fascination with flux, with the gleeful maintenance of paradoxical positions, which mirrors the philosopher Heraclitus's apparently contradictory view that while reality is a unity, it also involves a conflict of opposites. In Dada, the joyful transgression of boundaries, the banging together of fragments of incommensurate regimes of information or systems of signage, speaks of a particular attitude, which I would like to argue is both political with a small p and aesthetic simultaneously. Dada thrives on border positions. Let us now look at the question of borders in a slightly different sense, rather than look at the heady transgressions of categories or limits within Dada. Let's look at the issue of Dada's disdain for geographical borders in the way that it constituted itself as an art movement. Let us look, in other words, at the issue of its internationalism. In this connection, Timothy Benson notes that the political crisis in Germany, especially the failure of the Communist Revolution and the bloody suppression of the Munich Soviet, brought about for the Dadaists a crisis of the subject, which he sees as, quote, a crisis of location that ran parallel with Dada's self-location as a movement. Dada was never comfortable to stay in one place. It constituted itself spatially. One thing that's clear is that unlike several other avant-garde formations of the early 20th century, Futurism in Italy, for instance, or possibly Vorticism in Great Britain, the Dadaists abhorred any adherence to the notion of the nation or nation-state. As Martin Puchner has argued, just as international communism had perceived the capitalist wars of the early 20th century as bound up with national interests, so Dada did everything in its power to move beyond borders. The term Dada came to designate a kind of cultural Esperanto, a language that could freely migrate across cultures. The very centrality of sound poetry as one of the key inventions of Dada is indicative in this respect, since phonetic poetry does not speak in any one linguistic argot, but aspires to a kind of scrambled universal tongue. There you are, you can read that. After its initial incarnations in Zurich and Berlin, Dada was to spring up not just in the well-known locations that had tended to be identified with it, such as Zurich, Berlin, Cologne, Hanover, Paris, New York, but a multitude of global centres. The newer, spatialised readings of Dada that have recently been developing, therefore, require us to take in a set of venues which Puchner lists as, well, it's a long list, but anyway, I'll go through it quickly. Zagreb, Zurich, Warsaw, Weimar, Vienna, Trieste, The Hague, Terence, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Santiago de Chile, Rome, Prague, Paris, Okayama, New York, Munich, Madrid, Mantua, Leiden, Ljubljana, Krakow, Hanover, Geneva, Florence. Actually, it goes on. Furthermore, the Dadaists themselves moved between different locations with a complete disdain for any sense of belonging. Francis Picabia's journal 391, the longest lasting of the many small Dada magazines published in the multiple locations just mentioned, was an entirely peripatetic affair. As Picabia himself moved between France, Zurich, Barcelona, New York, and back to France, so his journal moved with him, produced in various formats in the different locations. A recent tendency has been to see the very condition of exile as integral to Dada, although, as Debbie Luer cautions, this principle was not exclusive to Dada. The strategies of the entire avant-garde, ranging from self-referentiality to mutual isolation, served to represent the artists as necessarily estranged and to ratify as canonical the works of radical estrangement. Displacement, though, has an integral relation both to Dada's history and its aesthetics. Having initially been formed by a group of artists in neutral Switzerland during the height of the First World War, including Romanians Zara and Janko and Germans Bâle and Hülsenbeck, it will be driven forward by French artists such as Picabia and Duchamp, whilst in voluntary exile in New York. Numerous other examples could be cited. At the same time, the theme of travel or itinerancy is frequently at the heart of Dada art. Man Ray's collage, that should be Man Ray, sorry. Transcontinental of 1921 is predicated on his move from New York, where Dada is reduced to the upturned contents of an ashtray, to Paris, indicated by a portion of a street map. Benson, who has been instrumental recently in developing a spatialized model of Dada, posits dissemination as the very principle by which it operated. He sees this collage by Carol Tige called Travel Postcard, 1923, as emblematic of a new Dada cartography. Posted from France, the postcard is addressed to Tige's colleague in the Prague-based De Wetzel group, Jaroslav Sefer. Photographs, maps, a postcard, and an envelope are combined to evoke movement across time, space, and memory. Just as Dada favoured the condition of rootlessness, a horror of fixity, so it is significant for the way it both broadcast its principles and simultaneously repudiated them. Puchner writes about the main avant-garde form developed by Dada, or arguably the main form, which is the Manifesto, as being forged in the tradition of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto of 1848. In the wake of a spate of futurist manifestos of 1912, those are the first real avant-garde manifestos, the Dada Manifesto became an exercise in irony. Zara's famous 1918 manifesto begins, "I'm writing a manifesto and there's nothing I want, and yet I'm saying certain things. And in principle, I'm against manifestos as I am against principles. I'm writing this manifesto to show that you can perform contrary actions at the same time." The perversely negative connotations of Zara's tirade are pushed further in Francis Picabia's cannibal Dada Manifesto of 1920, which is one of the best examples we have of the Dada desire to provoke. I quote, "Arise, you're all accused. Stand up as if for the Marseillaise, stand up for the Russian national anthem, stand up as if for God Save the King, and stand up before the flag, and finally stand up before Dada, which represents life, and which accuses you of liking everything for reasons of snobbery as soon as it costs a lot of money. What are you doing planted on your backsides like a load of serious-minded mugs?" Because that's what you are, isn't it? Serious. Serious, 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 until death stops you being serious. All you serious people, you smell worse than dung. Dada, as for it, smells of nothing. It is nothing, nothing, nothing. It might be argued then that Dada's internationalist ethos, its disdain for demarcations of region, of ideology, are to some extent reflected in its repudiation of conceptual positionality. As with its collage aesthetics, Dada's love of paradox, its negativism, its disruption of the comprehensible message, is a way of guarding against the notion of being confined within borders, whether these be definitional, ideological, symbolic, or geographical. As a Zurich Dadaist, Hans Richter, once observed, "We wanted to bring forth a new kind of human being, free from the tyranny of rationality, of banality, of generals, fatherland, nations, art dealers, microbes, resident permits, and the past." However, the problem with all this, if Dada was to hang on to its identity as a revolutionary artistic movement, was how to signal its principles to an audience outside of the purely self-referential terms of contradiction and paradox. We return then to the satirical pole of Dada activity, which I mentioned earlier. Insofar as satire inevitably expresses an opinion, however veiled that might be, it would appear to be unsuited to the Dada refusal of positionality. However, in the last part of this paper, I want to pursue the idea that Dada was able to develop a revolutionary aesthetics, fusing both satire and aesthetic experimentation, not by referencing revolution or revolutionary politics directly, but by metaphoricizing the very concept of revolution. To develop this point, we need to look at the close links that have been made between the notions of revolution and carnival and the works of Victor Stoichita and Anna Kodesh. In symbolic terms, carnival has been defined by Bakhtin as, quote, "the destruction of the old and the birth of the new," although in terms of its actual manifestations in Europe, which survived from ancient times, it inhabits a transitional period lasting from Epiphany to Lent, which at its height calls forth boisterous anti-authoritarian behavior. I think Cologne is the carnival centre of Germany, supposedly. The central motif of carnival, according to Stoichita and Kodesh, is a substitution of high for low and low for high, the figure of reversal. Turning to the notion of revolution, they note that the word revolution, having in ancient times referred to the end of a historical cycle, whilst in the 17th century it referred to extraordinary changes in the world, was superimposed by certain writers in the Age of Enlightenment onto the topos of the world turned upside down, the topos, in other words, of carnival or carnivalization. It is a carnivalesque grotesque in the inversions of Goya's work linked to his response to the revolutionary age in which he lived that concerns Stoichita and Kodesh. But it is interesting that Dada was seen by many of its contemporaries as having substantial affinities with carnival in terms of its embrace of paradox and symbolic reversal. Debbie Luer has recently drawn attention to the way in which, in the midst of the failing German Revolution, Berlin Dada's self-appointed Oberdada, Johannes Bade, periodically announced the creation of day one of a new calendar at the bottom right of the corner of the cover of the Berlin Dada magazine, Der Dada, modestly using his own birth as signalling the start of a new age. It's an oblique reminder here of the new Republican calendar proposed by the Revolutionary Convention in France in 1792. Although in Bade's work there is a sardonic overturning of the utopianism of the revolutionary calendar, which alludes to the fate of the longed-for German Revolution. To my mind, the most interesting examples of Dada's allusions to the carnivalesque, with their related intimations of a changed post-revolutionary world order, are to be found not so much in the epicenter of Dada's engagement with revolutionary failure, in other words, Berlin, but in New York. I'm thinking here of the work of Duchamp, often considered to be one of the least politicized Dadas. In a very late gesture, Duchamp brought out a magazine called New York Dada, in which we see the world upside down trope of the words New York Dada, which are repeatedly printed upside down to produce a series of typographic columns. This is on the left, as you can see. At the center of the cover, we see a photograph of a perfume bottle with the image of Duchamp integrated as a part of a mock label. This is an image of reversal or inversion, because rather than presenting himself straightforwardly, Duchamp is in fact chosen to adopt the guise of a Rose c'est la vie, a female alter ego, invented by him at some point in 1920 in collaboration with Man Ray. And there were other photographs taken by Man Ray of Duchamp as a rose. A couple of those are on the right. Now, I can't go into any detail about Duchamp's fascination with gender reversal. However, an earlier exploration of the theme, the other way around, which is, kind of a female-to-male transformation, is affected in possibly the most famous Dada gesture, one of the most famous ones, which is the El Chaucul of 1919. Produced at the time that the news of the suppressed German Revolution would have been current in France, the gesture epitomizes the very essence of carnival transformation and reversal. In the words of Stoikita, it's difficult to separate the theme of transvesticism from that of reversal. Both are at the heart of the carnival tradition. Elsewhere, they note, cross-dressing was very much part of the carnivalesque ritual and formed its own system with its companions, license and reversal. Scholars have made connections, in fact, with works by Goya dealing with, the image of the pregnant man, for instance, at the top right there. One can see these gender reversals as bound up with male insecurities arising from the social empowerment of women during the period of the First World War. But in the current context, it seems that the transgression of gender positionality, which is clearly in line with Dada's disdain for border demarcations, relates to a much broader politics in which the reversals of carnival are used ironically as analogues for revolutionary forces in culture at large. Dada seems in fact to point to a post-revolutionary situation where traditional gender positions are held up to question. And in this sense, the Dada carnivalesque acts as a prelude to shifts in gender politics that are still being worked out in 21st century culture. To return then to the question of the relation between politics and aesthetics in Dada, how could a revolutionary politics be inscribed within a new aesthetic? As noted earlier, Dada could only have functioned as satire if it had operated strictly in terms of an understandable semantic code. The Dadists preferred, however, to develop an aesthetic of otherness, using collage and photomontage techniques to create a language of formal upheaval which would reflect their radical refusal of categorical distinctions or of border positions, if we recall their opposition to national belonging, their internationalism. It was still possible, however, for Dada to retain a satirical edge and to communicate as politically oppositional to an audience. This was courtesy of the reversals and inversions of carnival with their symbolic relation to the figuring of revolution. Via the satirical inversions of carnival, the disruption of visual and conceptual conventions, for instance, conventions of gender designation, to say nothing of spatial location or temporality, could be made synonymous with the overturning of societal structures. It is here that Dada discovers a viable aesthetics of revolution.